Hello, I'm Michael Haynes, a journalist serving as LifeSite's senior Vatican correspondent. And in the wake of Pope Francis's death during the early hours of Monday morning here, I've been speaking to various secular news outlets trying to give some analysis on the situation, trying to explain what this means for the Catholic Church, what the next steps are going forward, and also the spiritual reality behind it all, because as Catholics, we have as paramount important the need to pray for the repose of the deceased person's soul. I hope you enjoyed this interview I gave recently to an affiliate with Fox News. And I want to thank you also for your support, because it is your support that enables LifeSite to keep coverage like this coming to you directly from the ground in Rome.
To continue this conversation, so I want to bring in Michael Haynes. He is the senior Vatican correspondent at LifeSite, and he's based out of Rome right now. Thank you for joining us this morning. Can you just share the sentiment in Rome this morning? What have you been seeing going on there?
Thank you very much. Yes, indeed. It's a very weird mixture. It's a shock to wake up to hear that the Pope has died, and at the same time, given his health condition over the past number of weeks, it's not a shock at the same time, because we've seen him go through that intense period of hospitalization where he nearly lost his life twice already. But then we saw him return to the Vatican, and he seemed very keen to continue trying to pursue as normal a daily routine as possible, making quite a few impromptu appearances in the Vatican and St. Peter's Square, really doing his, really trying to continue with as normal a life as possible whilst still battling his health conditions there. We've seen the decorations for Easter Sunday Mass. They've been hastily stripped away from the outside of the Vatican as the machine really gets itself moving for the pre-conclave meetings, for the papal funeral, and then finally, of course, for the conclave itself, which will see all the cardinals gather together in Rome to try and find the next successor of St. Peter, to find Pope Francis's successor as well.
Right, and I did want to talk to you a little bit later here about what the next steps will be. But as we're taking a live look at the Vatican right now, we do know there is going to be this service a little bit later tonight around 7:30 p.m. Rome time. Are you going to be attending that service for Pope Francis?
I hope to get down to that. Possibly also there's a rosary. The prayer of the rosary will be offered in St. Peter's Square a little bit before that Mass. So these are the first two initial public ceremonies of the Church is holding to pray for the soul of the Pope. Because for Catholics and for the Catholic Church, there is that priority of prayer for the spiritual well-being of the soul, but particularly around the time of the soul's death. And those masses will continue. We've seen statements, of course, coming in from public leaders, religious leaders all around the world. But many of the bishops and priests will also be now offering their masses today and in coming days over the Easter week for the repose of the soul of Pope Francis.
I did want to share this post that you put out on social media saying Cardinal Ray has summoned the cardinals to Rome after Pope Francis's death earlier today. Are you able to share with us the significance of this and what we can expect in the days to come?
Exactly. So this is the first step of the procedure that follows the death of the Pope. The Dean of the College of Cardinals has to summon all the cardinals around the world to come back to Rome for the conclave meetings. Many of those cardinals are already based in Rome. They work in the Roman Curia, but many of those are also just based in archdioceses around the world. So this is the first step. They have to gather in Rome. They have the pre-conclave meetings, which are really an opportunity for the cardinals to get to know each other, to weigh ideas against each other, to try and hear the various needs of the church as a global church, but also try and hear the issues present in particular areas. They will also use those meetings to decide details such as the date for the papal funeral, the date of the precise start of the conclave meetings itself, a very famous conclave meetings where we'll see all the cardinals closed inside the Sistine Chapel, where they will engage in their rounds of voting to elect the new pope. So these meetings they're part of the normal procedure, but they're very pivotal for the cardinals, because something we've seen with Pope Francis's style of electing or appointing cardinals, is that he's often chosen to find cardinals from far and wide across the globe, not in normal areas where cardinals would be. And so as a result of that, a number of the cardinals do not have a good knowledge of each other. And when you are electing a new pope, you desperately need to have a good knowledge of the man that you're sitting next to, the man that you might be voting for.
And as we do continue to look ahead to the next several days here, the future of this, Pope Francis approved a simplified version of the funeral of the rites of the Roman pontiff back in November. How is this going to be different compared to what we have seen in history? And in terms of the funeral and details, what can you share with us about how this may be different?
Indeed. So, as you say, he made the papal funeral simpler. He's changed the number of coffins which the Pope would be situated in. Normally, it'd be a series of coffins of different materials. It's now only going to be one coffin. He also changed the location of where the body is certified as being officially deceased. That will now take place in his chapel. The precise details about how the funeral is going to be actually taking place in terms of who's going to preside over the ceremony, those have not yet emerged to us. I suspect they will come maybe as early as tomorrow, given that the first meeting of all the cardinals, at least all those who can make it, is taking place tomorrow morning. There had, of course, been a very large celebration planned for this coming weekend, the canonization of a young teenage boy, Blessed Carlo Acutis, and there were many tens of thousands of pilgrims due to arrive in Rome for that. So it's quite possible the Vatican might decide to try and hold the funeral in and around this weekend in order to allow those pilgrims to perhaps come and pray for the Holy Father, given that they are already in Rome.
I would love to speak about his legacy, because the road to Pope Francis's election was paved by Pope Benedict XVI's decision to resign and retire. That was the first time that happened in 600 years. And Pope Francis getting elected, a lot of people think, was a breath of fresh air, so to speak. Can you explain how he came to assume this position, this role of the Pope, and why this was such a change for the Catholic Church?
Exactly. So Pope Francis was marked by a series of firsts. He was the first Jesuit Pope, obviously the first to take the name Francis. He was the first Pope from South America, closely following on the heels of Pope Benedict, who was the first Pope to resign in many centuries. So the Church was already in a position of tumult, really, when Pope Francis arrived, given Pope Benedict's shock resignation. The legacy of Pope Francis, I think, also has been one that's been marked by various confusions and various divisions. He's been very vocal, for instance, in calling for peace, especially in numerous conflicts around the globe. Often he's used his Sunday Angelus addresses to highlight those particular aspects. But at the same time, there's been concerns raised by those within the Church that a number of his statements or declarations have really increased confusion surrounding the Church's practice, the Church's teachings on faith and morality. One particular instance would be the surprise declaration that he issued in the summer of 2021, when he promulgated some very wide-ranging restrictions on the Church's traditional Latin Mass, which is something that has baffled many, continues to do so, because the Latin Mass is something that really has been one of the most thriving areas for the Church. It's seen a great number of young people, young families come to it. And at a time when the Church is really stagnating, particularly in Europe, it's very peculiar, to say the least, to cut back on those. We've seen also other areas of confusion in terms of the recent long-running synod, which Pope Francis has been hosting at the Vatican. there've been campaigners who've been calling for the synod to be their vehicle, if you like, to implement change which would go against the church's traditional teaching. And at the same time, there've been many Catholics who've been concerned that such a synod would indeed be a dilution of the faith. And so Pope Francis has been really at the center of this controversy on a number of issues over many years. He's often been a source of anger for those on the left for not quite going far enough. But at the same time, giving concern for traditional Catholics who fear that the integrity of the faith might be diluted.
And right as we're discussing this, we're actually getting in this post from the Vatican right now, saying that Pope Francis inspired political action rooted in solidarity and highlighting the critical role of religions in building peace. As you're saying, though, some of these stances that he had taken, maybe causing some controversy. But as we know, the Pope, he chose to live in a guest house rather than the papal apartments. He took a bus back to his hotel after his election. Are you able to dive just a little bit deeper into these issues and maybe a little bit more about the Pope's legacy, as we're hearing from the Vatican saying, you know, he had this critical role in building peace?
That's right. The interesting thing about his life in the guest house, the Pope is very much keen to be around people. He doesn't enjoy being alone. And that was actually one of the aspects that came out a little bit later into his pontificate, that he moved back to that guest house because he didn't want to be somewhat isolated in the apostolic palace, which the popes traditionally use. He wanted to be situated around people. And of course, that's very much where the hustle and bustle of Vatican activity is. A lot of the clerics who live and work in the Vatican are there, so he can be very much in the mix. The document that you mentioned there, Fratelli Tutti, that's been cited by a great number of groups, a great number of political bodies who've been working to try and promote, especially interreligious activities. The Pope himself has cited it on a number of occasions in meetings, dialoguing with other religious leaders, particularly those of the Islamic world. That document itself has been a source of controversy because Catholics have been concerned that it proposes a move away from the hierarchical or the vertical structure within the Catholic Church where you look towards God, and it proposes more of a lateral looking amongst fellow man, but removing the spiritual aspect to it. And this, I think, has been the element behind a number of the Pope's documents, whilst appearing initially very, very appealing to many. For those within the Church, there's often been a particular element that's proposed by the Pope that's left them with a great source of concern for the Church's perennial teaching.
All right, Michael Haynes, out of Rome right now. Thank you so much for your reporting. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
For U.S. residents, creating a will has never been easier. Thanks to My Legacy Will, an online platform free of charge, you can now create your own will and choose to include LifeSite News in it. Specify where your funeral will take place, the number of masses to be offered for your soul, and how your estate will be distributed. We would be deeply grateful if you remembered LifeSite News in your will. Visit mylegacywill.com/LifeSite News. Thank you for your support, and may God bless you.
Let's continue on diving into what we know and what's upcoming in terms of the funeral. We want to bring into the conversation right now Michael Haynes, senior Vatican correspondent. Thank you so much for joining us here on Live Now from Fox. I know we've already spoken to you today, but what more do we know about this funeral service? We saw the prayer and rosary service. What comes next in terms of all the things in place at the Vatican?
Well, in fact, just a few minutes before I joined you, the Vatican issued the official certification of Pope Francis's death. So the medical professionals there issued a statement to the press corps. They stated that the Pope had a stroke, coma, and irreversible cardiac arrest. And they mentioned also his recent medical history of bilateral pneumonia, arterial hypertension, and multiple bronchiectasis. Apologies for the mispronunciation there in the medical terminology, but But this was the formal certification that is part of the normal procedure, but nevertheless highlights the sort of the underlying conditions of the Pope's health and the true import of what happened this morning.
Yeah, and of course, we're getting more information about that. And you mentioned the health as he spent 30 plus days at Gemelli Hospital from that double pneumonia, finally being released from the hospital, showing up at the Easter ceremony. Can you speak to that? Because he said that he wanted to be the Pope for life, and that's certainly what he accomplished, but overcoming some of these health obstacles to stay very active with the faith, active as this Pope in the Catholic Church. Can you speak to that? And now that we know some of this information, what Pope Francis was able to do in his final days?
Indeed, so there had been a lot of talk or speculation about a possible resignation, especially as his stay in hospital continued and his condition worsened. Pope Francis has always sort of brushed off that suggestion. He's always been very keen to, I think, remain in power, to remain as Pope. He wasn't going to follow the example of Benedict XVI. So his decision was always to remain in office, I think, until he died, although he would toy with interviews sometimes when they would pose the question about the possible resignation. But I think that was something we saw in evidence on Easter Sunday. The fact that he decided to come out to deliver that Urbi et Orbi blessing and then to make a tour of the square. Quite a considerable length of time he was there without the use of his oxygen, although you could see that he appeared very physically frail. He had his mouth open a lot of the time, presumably, I imagine, to just aid in getting air. So that always has been part and parcel of the Francis pontificate. It's received criticism also in terms of how he has used power in his pontificate, but that's always been a central aspect to understand his 12 years on the throne, how he employs and understands his own power as Pope and how he wields it. And it seemed that his decision was always to die with his boots on, as many have commented already.
Yeah, and of course, that was the final moment, really, that we saw him there in front of so many people acting in that humble way that he is so very well known for. I do want to put up this, again, as you talked about it, this certificate of death, the cause of death for Pope Francis revealed officially due to cerebral, stroke, coma, and irreversible cardiac arrest. Previously had that acute respiratory failure and the bilateral pneumonia. Of course, we were detailing that very, very closely. This is a post from yourself, Michael, about this revelation that we are gathering right now. And of course, we talk about the life and the funeral that will be upcoming, but in the Catholic Church, they also talk about the death of the soul. Can you speak a little bit more to that and why it is so important for Pope Francis and the Church as a whole?
Indeed. So the Catholic Church always teaches that physical death indeed is one thing, but also that we have an immortal soul which never dies. And that's why we have such great teaching on the true import of actions, whether actions are sinful or not. We have the classifications of two kinds of sin, venial or mortal sin. And the Church teaches that in order to attain heaven, then one must not die in a state of mortal sin, that is, to die in a state of having an unconfessed or unrepentant mortal sin on one's soul, which is why there is such a concentration of prayer around the Pope, particularly because as the Pope leading the flock on earth, he has such a weighty responsibility, and why there's a necessity really for all Catholics to have a filial devotion to the Pope in terms of especially praying for his spiritual well-being, because none of us take for granted that by virtue of one's position or by virtue of lofty office, that means one is somehow safe in the terms of salvation. In fact, the dangers are greater, the higher the responsibility. And so the Church teaches that, especially for the Pope, but even more so than for others, there is that duty to pray for him, particularly to continue to pray after death. We don't wish to move into areas of ceasing to pray for him or to say such lovely epithets about him that we no longer think he's in need of our prayers. The Church always has this very constant emphasis on continued prayer, no matter if it's before or after death.
Yeah, that's a good point and a good revelation about the hierarchy, both there now and what his role was as the Pope, because he really talking about the humility there as he continued to have concern for the poor from the very beginning for that 12-year papacy. Let's take us back a little bit, 12 years ago, because it was a humble beginning for Pope Francis, taking the name of Francis. Can we detail that a little bit? Because I think that greatly symbolizes what his term as Pope was about, just taking on the name Francis.
Indeed. So the name Francis, obviously, he was the first Pope to take that name. And I think much has been made of this. He's given quite an attention to those elements. He's tied into elements which he's seen in Saint Francis, who is the Franciscan saint that he took the name of, particularly relating to areas of nature. He's tried to employ some of Saint Francis's attention to nature in more of his ecological writings. Some of those have been sources of a lot of controversy in the Catholic Church because of the Pope's attention to those over other aspects. But that being said, the Pope has also been quite notable in terms of his issuing calls for peace, which have been really increasing. He's been making those on a regular weekly basis now in his Sunday addresses, often his general audiences on Wednesdays, in which he always calls to mind that it is the poor especially who suffer, the innocent who suffer as a result of wars. And he's tried to renew those aspects, those calls, as conflicts seem to increasingly emerge across the globe. But at the same time, the papacy that we've seen over this last 12 years has also certainly been one of confusion, really. There's been a lot of division within the Church over many aspects of the Pope's pontificate, and those will now have to be addressed, I think, by his successor, whoever that turns out to be.
Hi everyone, this is John Henry Weston for LifeSite News. We hope you found this video insightful. For more content like this, be sure to check out the links in the description below. You can also follow us on social media to stay updated on the latest news concerning life, faith, family, and freedom. Thanks for watching, and may God bless you.